came to you truly stuck, because I couldn't see how what Jesus had preached in his inaugural sermon in his own synagogue in Nazareth merited such a reaction of fury and running him out of town to hurl him off a cliff. And you guys really helped me a great deal to see the text with more clarity. So I'm back today to share what I saw. I went back to that worship service in Nazareth that we were invited into. The widow of Zarephath didn't have any food left, but she had a son. So she was getting ready to make one last meal and then starve to death. That's her story. Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram, a powerful man who went to Elisha with gold and silver, ready to pay for the healing that he had heard Elisha could offer him. So I saw those two stories, and I saw the parts about the widow and the commander not being Jews. But the Bible is full of reminders that while God may have a chosen people, God cares for all of creation. But I had forgotten that Isaiah, who Jesus read his prophecy, was the son of Amoz. And Isaiah shared his visions during the reigns of Uzziah and Jotham and Ahaz and Hezekiah, all kings of Judah, of the southern kingdom of Israel. That Elijah was from the town of Tishbe in Gilead. That God sent Elijah to hang out with the widow of Zarephath in Sidon, outside of the land of Israel. What I had passed over was the particularities. Isaiah, son of Amoz. Elijah, the Tishbite. The widow of Zarephath. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram. Jesus, Joseph's son. God is not asking for a good average. God is not asking for faithful behavior in general. God is very, very particular. Very, very focused on the individual. Now, I can agree that in general, on average, I merit salvation. But in particular, looking at each decision I make, there is no chance. There is no hope. Jesus is just coming into his ministry. He's going to make it clear again and again that God is offering salvation without strings attached to each of us in particular. Salvation which none of us deserves, but we have to be willing to acknowledge that we don't control our own salvation. If we want to maintain our own illusions that we're in control and that on average we're safe, and we're saved, well then God has made it perfectly clear that God deals with particular individuals and not on average. Then I looked at who said what to whom before the huge rage thing started to boil up. Jesus is the local boy who made good He's been invited to read and reflect in the synagogue, presumably because they know him and they've heard about how he was filled with the power of the Spirit. And clearly something has happened in Capernaum that he expects them to be interested in. And we join Jesus right there, right in the center of his community. He is surrounded by their praise and by their amazement. And he's the one who steps away. He's the one that says, truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in a prophet's hometown. Jesus sets himself on the edge. Of all the examples he could have taken from the Torah, he chooses two about God working on the edge of the community through people on the edge. The widow has no husband, no grown son to connect her to the resources of the community, and she is literally dying of hunger when Elijah shows up. Naaman may be an army commander with wealth at his disposal, but he is going to be exiled from his community because of his leprosy. By saying, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, Jesus is saying that God is unfolding a new narrative. And then Jesus reminds the community who raised him, the community that he stands right in the middle of, that God's new narrative always unfolds in edge places, with edge people. God's new narratives are told through slaves in Egypt, in wildernesses with no food or water, led by people who have walked away from everything because God has called them. So last week I argued that part of our tradition understands that God is still speaking, as Cindy reminded us during her reflection on stewardship. We look at Scripture and understand that it is not pointing backwards to one fixed thing or forward to one end goal. So part of what I was struggling with was, how does this particular passage from Luke speak to us today? And thinking about Jesus' community sitting in their synagogue, sitting in a place that literally means a place to be together. That's what synagogue means. They hear that the captives are released, that the blind can see, that the oppressed are free. I can see that scene so clearly because I have a place that's like that. In the reading from Luke, I hear that he promises I hear that the promises God has made are fulfilled. And I can't believe I lived to see it, right? If you're in that synagogue that day, here are these promises that are thousands of years old. And here is someone who's credibly saying, they are fulfilled. And you live to see it. The Messiah is someone I know, someone I helped to raise. On that Saturday morning, I have heard something that rocks my world. Now, do I change my life? Well, coming back to the present, I heard about a disease that was capable of overwhelming the hospitals in New York City. I heard about an epidemic that tore through a church choir out on the West Coast because they wanted to practice one last time. I heard about a transformation in my world that meant life would never be the same again, And yet my desire for normalcy and constancy and predictability meant that I gathered up all my dashed hopes, all my suspicions and all my fears, and I looked for the first cliff I could toss them over. Because I wanted to get back to the middle of the life that I had before I heard the world was changing. So yeah, reminded that I can't play the averages and control my own salvation, reminded that God works in edge places with edge people, reminded that it will take a lot of denial to hold on to a spot in the middle of the life I was used to, particularly when God is unfolding a new narrative. Okay, yeah. I can see myself on that cliff edge, wanting to push over all that fear and suspicion, all those dashed hopes. And yet, at the very end of that passage, Jesus passed through the midst of the crowd and went on his way. Standing on that cliff face, I don't want to pay attention to the people who have accepted, even embraced, that they are edge people living in an edge place. Those of us who are clinging to the safe spot in the center are not going to see them. And sure, we can agree that they are the captives and the blind and the oppressed. But step into today's world. What about the people who cannot be medically vaccinated against COVID? Not the ones who have chosen to remain in the center of their communities by rejecting the vaccine, but those who would love to be vaccinated, but whose bodies will not accept it. Every time God unfolds a new narrative, there is a new edge. And there are people living on that edge. And we turn away from them because we want to hold on to the world before that edge was unfolded. Now, our tradition urges us to come back each week and check in with each other, to hear the scriptures read, and see if we can find someone who can help us see how we can say, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. You were lucky enough. You were alive today when it happened. Maybe we find ourselves on the edge of a cliff. Maybe we find ourselves ghosting through a crowd of angry people to go on our way. But maybe we get to take a minute and realize that God is unfolding a new narrative, one that we can choose to say yes to, one that we can invite and urge and cajole our community to join us on. Even the ones we can't see what all the fury is.